many thanks first for the presentations. And of course, I should have said Rafał Pankowski was at the Karlsruhe dialogues on Rechtsextremismus in Europa heute. Und das war in 2009 die 13. Karlsruhe Gespräche. Und damals, und deswegen sage ich das jetzt auch als Anfang zu unserem Gespräch, sorry, I'm going to speak in English, sorry, I'm in the wrong language, getting a long day. I'll start again, so that you can understand. Rafał was at the 13th Karlsruhe Dialogues, indeed, and then it was on right-wingism, right extremism in Europe. And at that time, this is why I'm saying so, because I think it's we can draw in on what you've been saying. Our thesis was, the main thesis at the 13th Karlsruhe Dialogues was that right extremism starts in the middle of society. And it is not just organized representation as one finds in right-wing or right-extreme parties, but in fact, and I think if we look now, the years later, then this is something we are finding with new representations, but also with many examples of those who may change and vote for right-wing movements, although they themselves not active parties member. But the second thing, and this is what I would like to bring in on, was at that time we also talked about the role of women. We identified that also in organized right-wing extremist movements, that women were not just the sort of those who kind of looked after what was happening, but were actually themselves active and also beginning to take on roles where they were also the activists within right-wing things. So my question to you, first of all, would be your experience after, through and after the Arab rebellion, as we call it, the change of the actual role of young women like yourself, who are becoming more active, are having more voice. Can you maybe say something to that before we sort of perhaps then look at the role also of women in the student movements, and then we can carry on from there, if you might.
Yeah, of course. I mean, anything that happens in the society, it's just normal that women will be involved in it, whether it was a change towards something positive or a change towards something negative. In the case of the revolution, what was really ironic in Libya, that the first person who went out on the street and said, we have a famous say during the revolution where it's basically saying, let's throw the regime, that was a woman. Although that what has been shown in the media, even for Libyans themselves, we were just seeing protests of men and young men in the street holding signs where they're actually saying, well, we need to get rid of the Gaddafi system and we need a new system that respects democracy, freedom of speech and human rights and everything. However, the first person who really went out on the street and said that out loud, it was a woman. Then later on, the rest of the protests, anything that was related to the humanitarian aid, activism, even on a political level during the transition between going from the revolution to establishing a country and a system, women were involved in that. However, what's really ironic is that every time we talk about the role of women in conflicts and peace building and extremism, etc., we often talk about them as soft agents or as passive. Either they are doing something good, you know, they are heroes, they are contributing to humanitarian aid, or they are political activists, or they are human rights activists, or they're just not doing anything. And the reasons that if we look at the images and the media, it's literally, we see young men fighting each other. However, we are not paying attention to what's happening back home. I've seen mothers and sisters and wives myself who were encouraging their men, sons, husbands, cousins, etc., where they will tell them it's a pride if you will go and fight and kill another Libyan and die. So not looking at that, not looking at how the social construction can change during wartime or revolutions, and who's really behind of that, who's holding that. Because again, all what we see young men fighting each other, and we keep forgetting about who's giving the support. Even if we're not seeing women holding Kalashnikovs or weapons in the front line of the battles, but in a way or another, they are contributing in the violence. And looking at the peace talks and the peace-building process in Libya and the inclusion of women, I think as long as we are not aware that women can be as violent as men during war times, then we keep missing the opportunity and the fact that women can also be peace builders during peacetime. So it's like, it's about recognizing that women and men have the exact same role in wars and violence as much as in peace and peace building. Maybe the practices is different, but both roles are complementing each other.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I just ask, Rafał, when we saw the video of subcultural and of course the right-wing subculture in music, which is also being used, those who come to these rallies, can you say something also about men and women? Just as I think it's one point which we haven't looked at yet in the conference enough.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, if you look at the history of the far right in Poland, not so long ago, there was a political party that was in the parliament and even in the government for a short time, the League of Polish Families, which was a very well chosen name, by the way. And that had a significant support base among women. And even many of the members of parliament were women, more than any other political party in Poland. The percentage was higher than any other party. Well, but since that time, that has changed. And if you look at the composition of those rallies, very clearly the majority are young men. There is no doubt about that. And I think I mentioned football already today. The football culture actually plays a big part in that as a political platform, as a platform for promoting ideas and ideologies, and it is a culture that is strongly dominated by young men.
Okay. Well, how can you add to this discussion with your the study that you were looking at with student movements, which of course is I think it was very interesting what you were saying about student movements, on the one hand being a barometer of what's happening in society. So if we're saying that it's not just the extreme, but it starts very much earlier with disappointed expectations, I think, of course, with austerity politics and the non-given perspectives, is that again a sort of both male and female and no difference, or do we find that those who are sort of the leaders of protest movements are gender-mäßig different?
Well, is it working? I would say in the current situation in Poland, for instance, what is very interesting that actually gender really did come to the fore during this black protest and this women's strike, which was actually a protest against a proposed total abortion ban. And not only that, this attracted actually the younger generation for the first time, because same as with the anti-ACTA protest, it seems that youth are triggered by more everyday life issues rather than abstract political things like the Constitutional Court, which they don't really care that much because it doesn't seem to affect their lives. But abortion was immediately one of those things that galvanized women, but also a lot of young men came out in support. It was pretty massive. And it was actually also copied in other countries. And I would even say that the women's marches in the US had some, you know, there is some relation to there. So we are seeing a sort of new, maybe, I wouldn't call it yet feminism, but there is definitely a gendering of protest. On the other hand, as I mentioned in the talk, again, looking at Poland, it's, if you look at some of the radical students from the late 80s, in 89, this generation of 89 that has now come to the fore, these are very much the people who are thinking in anti-elitist terms, majoritarian terms, who are very much behind also this rise of these populist parties. So if I take the apathy, for instance, in Poland now, which we might also expect in other countries, because the disappointment and so on can lead, it's hard to say where, let's say in 20 years, those people, when they are coming into the elites, and with no mention, like the Greeks who've known this austerity, what this actually might lead to ideas. I think we're very much now in uncharted territory.
Yes, I think that's a very important point. You made the point about the situation, sorry, you made the point about situations, generation of war. With Ukraine as one of the things. We have the generation of failed state in Libya, and we have a generation of economic austerity. So these are three very negative and serious effects, which probably have long-term effects of what we sometimes call a lost generation. So maybe I come back to you and especially ask the point about peace building. I think we, of course, within the Anna Lindh Foundation and many other foundations talk a lot, and we will talk tomorrow about the importance of dialogue. But apathy, how do we get youth interested in dialogue, or what are the different kind of mainstays of starting to get people, young people, interested and looking at us for alternatives and not just having the angry generation of disappointed expectations? What would you think, so that we can take this into the conversation tomorrow morning? Who would you like to say something first? There's a microphone there. Because I think we tend to think, I mean, even if we look this morning, we were talking also about situation, if we think of what we used to call the troubles between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. That was a generation of 30 years of all socialization and education of young people was very, very clearly determined by the troubles, the so-called troubles in Northern Ireland, where you learned you belong to the one or you belong to the other, you hate or you don't hate. So I'm just asking you, because I think in a failed state where there's competition of different groups to gain the support of a very young population, how do you see the situation for where do you start to quite practically to do peace building?
Practically, I would say young people are already involved in that. Peace building happens on a local level, on a national level, sometimes on an international level, where we have, for example, the UN intervening or different governments or anything like that, who's basically not a partner or not someone from the inside. However, looking at the Libyan case or looking at any other conflict areas, young people are already engaged in peace building. Maybe they are not walking around saying that, well, we are peace builders, but if you look at anyone who's really trying their best, and I'm emphasizing on young people who are doing that, in terms of, it can be anything. I mean, even peace building, even for Libyans, it might not sound relevant. Even for local Libyans, saying peace building might not sound relevant, because what we are talking about, for them, it sounds like a very political process, where political groups will come together, discuss their own interest, and the interest of the society is left out. And that's where it seems that the interest of youth is left out. However, I mean, I see in Libya and all around the world, there's so many youth who are politically engaged, who are engaged in peace building, who are engaged in security matters, in the extremism, countering terrorism debate, etc. But the problem is not with how can we make youth active. The problem is that the existing systems, it doesn't seem that there is enough chairs to add to the peace building table where youth can actually sit in that chair and be decision makers. If we look at the peace building process in Libya, it says that, well, it included the youth perspective. However, it was mainly on a side meeting with a number of youth where they were like just talking to youth for one day, and then they said, well, we included youth. However, the process of the peace talks itself, it took almost 2 years. Why we didn't see young people sitting in that table, those who are running organizations on ground, those who are doing research on peace building, etc. And I always say the best example that youth are already working, we have the Security Council, the United Nations adopted the 2250 Security Council resolution, which particularly say that member states should take into account a youth perspective and engage youth in peace building. And what is really good about this resolution is that it wasn't that the Security Council just woke up one day and decided to adopt this resolution. It was a hard work of different youth organizations and youth activists for more than 6 years, where youth were demanding the Security Council, the United Nations, to formally recognize the role of youth in peace building. So I see the problem, it's not that how can we make youth engaged, it's more or less that the existing systems, it seems that there isn't any mechanisms where we can actually guarantee that youth are sitting in the peace negotiations, for example.
Okay, maybe I can ask Rafał Pankowski. I think that is obviously it's a slow process. It's a process which also involves structures. It involves also capacity building, in engagement in debate. But when I look at Poland now, with the images we saw, are the developments there so accelerated and so quick and so growing? Well, you say I thought that was also very interesting, the internationalization of nationalism, which we see in many rallies where, especially with the right wing, where we find that within European space, they all come and join a rally. So we have the problem of the acceleration on the one hand of what we are trying to debate on. So I would think perhaps the asymmetrical development of growing unpluralistic movements, and the thing that we're trying to do is to organize, first of all, young people just to be interested. Maybe you, I mean, I don't think the people that you were showing us on these images, they would join us in debate.
That could be difficult. Absolutely. No, I'm sure you are right. The pace of events and the sort of rapid pace of those social changes we have observed over the last 2 years or so is really special. And I think there was a moment when a certain critical mass was reached on different levels, also on the level of intensity of hate speech in social media, etc., when a spillover effect took place. And today it is much more difficult to think of remedies, because I see the situation as rather dramatic in many ways. But it didn't appear all of a sudden. It's a process that had been taking place for years before it became, I would say, largely mainstream. The phenomenon is not marginal anymore. But if I could just make one or two points in relation to what has been said earlier, of course the whole issue of economic austerity is an important context to the current state of right-wing extremism all over Europe and beyond. But I think in the case of Poland, it's interesting to note that Poland was actually the only country in the EU that kept economic growth throughout the crisis. the growth was slowed down, but it was still there. I mean, the crisis didn't hit Poland as dramatically as it hit Greece, for example, or Latvia, or many other places. So I'm not playing down the hardship that many young people experienced. But I think it is important to stress that this is not the only factor at play. Definitely not the only factor, and possibly it is much more difficult to be unemployed when you are 50 than when you are 25. But still, there is no surge in right-wing extremism among the older people, but there is a surge of right-wing extremism among the younger. So I think there are other issues to be looked at, and I think the role of popular culture again is very important in all this. So issues around identity and values are just as important as the economic context. And my last remark now will be about the case of a political movement that's actually called the Cookies movement in Poland now. Cookies is somebody's name. Paweł Cookies is a former rock singer who decided to become a politician just 2 years ago. And he got 20% of the vote in the presidential election. He got 10% of the vote with his new party, movement, at the parliamentary election in the autumn of 2015. So he has about 10% of seats in the parliament. And I would actually argue that would be the Polish far-right party that is in many ways similar to Jobbik and others. And when it started, it was a hodgepodge of different groups. I think today it is more or less clear it has become a radical right nationalist party to the right of the ruling party, Law and Justice. And I think that is in some ways symbolic. There is a rock star who translates the social capital that he had as a musician into political capital as a right-wing populist leader, and I think that is interesting to note. I said it was my last point. No, it wasn't. Sorry. There is another one. The popular culture. This is something that we tried to use for a long time, and with mixed results, but with some good results too. And let me just give you one example. You may or may not have heard of a festival that takes place every year on the Polish-German border that is called the Polish Woodstock Festival. And we are very active there with an anti-racism message every time it takes place. And there is about 500,000 people there every year. And that's a lot of people. And it has a very different atmosphere to the rally I told you about. So the picture is not all negative, but still, I think the challenges we are facing just now in Poland and elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe are very serious.
Yes.
If I just pick up on that, I largely agree, and I would also want to say that if we look at certain polls done among high school students, so not yet voting youth, we see it's going to get worse. They're moving more and more to the right. And there is an element, and I think Rafał probably even can elaborate on that more, of it's kind of fashionable to consume all kinds of patriotic nationalist symbols. I mean, so many young people are suddenly remembering the Warsaw Uprising, though they don't really exactly know what it was, but they like wearing various attire with the symbols of the Polish resistance. Actually, Cookies himself very much promotes that. So it turns into a kind of sort of, consumer product. And this is definitely fueling this process. And another thing I just wanted to mention, because I don't think this came up. So when it comes, and which, it's the biggest far-right manifestation in Europe right now, these independent marches. But I think there's been an important evolution. The last two were not violent, but were more or less condoned by the authorities. First the president, and then, of course, and the government. But before that, this was a day that they would come down to the capital and there would be street fights. I mean, actually the last one, they even set, well, not part of it, but near the premises of the Russian embassy, they set a guardhouse on fire, and police were shooting rubber bullets. They attacked also a squad. So these were very violent events, and suddenly in the last 2 years, they've stopped being violent and they're seemingly becoming institutionalized. So I don't know to what extent, for instance, let's say social media helps on this, but definitely the contacts with abroad, that helps. But to what extent the fact that they are gaining some kind of recognition institutionally from the authorities, that these are manifestations of like national pride and patriotism. I don't know how you feel about that.
Interesting thesis.
Right. Well, I mean, you are absolutely right. The last 2 marches were less violent than the previous ones, but in terms of the reasons for it, I'm not that sure. I think a big part of the reason is that, well, simply speaking, there are people in Warsaw, many people in Warsaw, who are afraid to go out on that day to the streets because they remember the violence that took place in previous years. So the streets are largely empty, and they're occupied by right-wing extremists. When the ONR, the National Radical Camp, marched in Białystok, which is a city in the northeast of Poland, in April, it was another interesting case because the day before the march, the local university issued a warning to the international students not to leave their houses on that day because it could be dangerous, which is a very unfortunate statement on the situation. So there are more of those marches, not just the one in Warsaw. That is largely recognized by the current authorities. And like you said, the president of Poland, the current president, wrote a letter to the march, more or less endorsing it and saying it represents the burning hearts of Polish young patriots that he welcomes. And I thought that was an unnecessary thing to do. In terms of legitimizing the ideology behind the march. But the march is another example of the sort of hijacking of patriotic traditions by the far right, something you also alluded to, and the largely superficial understanding of Polish history and Polish identity that is very characteristic of those new movements.
A last question, because we are coming to an end with our time. We have the phenomenon of what we look at here, which we're going to be, there's a reading tomorrow night in the theatre by an author, Gunnar Yasemin Balci, who has written a book about a jihadi bride. I'm just telling you because she gets to know a Syrian through Facebook, and she then, she doesn't know him, but she then follows him to the Turkish-Syrian border and goes across to Syria, not knowing what really her friend, who she has developed a relationship with through social media, and she has gone. So I was just wondering with the question of very often young women, and I think it's very different between your side of the Mediterranean and our side of the Mediterranean, because often we find that the young women who go to Syria or elsewhere to be a jihadi bride come from fairly good economic situation. They are not the radically deprived. We had the situation in the UK where it was really middle class, third generation. I'm looking at Kenan Malik, who went off with some kind of a romantic idea of being hero brides in this situation. Is that a phenomenon which is in any way relevant to what's happening on your side of the Mediterranean? I'll give you the...
Well, as far as I know, at least in Libya, the majority of young Libyan women are still inside the country. Maybe that says something. But when you were telling this story now, it just came to my mind that I've heard of something similar maybe 7 years ago on Dr. Phil's show, where they brought this story of a woman who met a young man through, I think it was at that time MySpace, and then she went to him, and then he was a drug dealer. I mean, it's more or less exactly the same story. The difference is that in this case, it's being linked to extremism and radicalization because it just sounds so obvious. And if we look why this woman went to meet this man or marry this man, we would just think that she wanted to be a jihadi bride. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't.
No, I don't think she did. I think she was being romantic, and it was the sort of going off on a journey to Turkey, Syria to meet the man who she loved. We'll see. I haven't read the book, but I'm not saying that she went to be a jihadi bride knowing where she was going to. But I just wondered, I mean, we see a lot of radicalization of young women, I would say by not really intentionally being radicalized. They get into a context where the young men have, I suppose, drawn up relationships to them, and then they join a context which they don't really know.
Yeah, you know, if living the war in Libya taught me one thing, is that people are not born violent, people are born into violence. And that's something completely different, because even me, myself, when I used to look at other wars in the region before it comes to Libya, I used to think this is the way it is there. And I would link anything that will happen, it's because of the war, it's because they are violent, it's all because of the war. And we keep forgetting that there is other dimensions. I mean, I'm not saying that, again, this young woman, she might have joined him, like this young man, to be a jihadi bride. She might didn't. The problem comes where is that, as I mentioned earlier, when we try to look at everything, we identify a problem based on the characteristics of people rather than the action itself. And that's the thing with extremism and terrorism, is that we're not looking at the action. Are we talking about violence? Because if we are talking about violence, there is even governmental groups who are violent, but then we don't call them terrorists. Maybe we call them a non-democratic government, but we don't call them terrorists. And then when we say terrorists, we focus on a certain group of people, and then we try to see what is the common thing between those people. It can be religion, it can be a political ideology, it can be anything, and then we just narrow our focus on that. And all the problems that comes alongside, we just keep blaming these problems and looking at the root causes of these problems because of this, whether it can be something completely different. I mean, in the youth discourse, when it comes to the question why the majority of armed groups, militias, and extremist groups are young men, and then the easiest solution or the easiest root cause to think of is that, well, there isn't enough employment. And I think ISIS has proved that completely wrong when we had engineers and doctors who really had well-steady jobs and left their jobs and went to join this armed group. Yes. So it's more or less every context have a different reason and a different environment. But again, looking at a situation based on what is the common characteristic, I think that's what is really going wrong with policies on peace building, countering violent extremism, and de-radicalization, etc. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. I think if there's no urgent replete, then we shall come to an end, because I know that we are quite a bit over the time.